My operatic friends, we're ready to bring down the curtain on the 2018-2019 season. I'm going to give you a few things to listen for this afternoon and a few things to think about regarding our final production of Puccini's classic tearjerker, Madama Butterfly. But first, travel back in time with me. The year is 1964. A skinny, shy, introverted piano student is practicing several hours a day. He's moderately talented. He goes in competitions, wins a few of them, and he doesn't pay much attention to opera. But then, in his general music class in the 7th grade at Nichols Junior High School in Evanston, Illinois, there is a unit on opera. And the teacher, whose name has long been forgotten, does a unit on Butterfly. And it's a revelation to this skinny young man. He's intoxicated with Puccini's sumptuous music, and then a few months later, his dad takes him to New York along on a business trip and splurges on a couple of tickets in the nosebleed seats at the old Metropolitan Opera House to see Renata Scotto perform the role of Cho-Cho-san, and that's it. That skinny young man is permanently infected with the opera virus, and his name was Glenn Winters. Yes, that was my portal of entry into the pleasure of opera 54 some years ago. I hope that if you're going to encounter your first opera with our production of Butterfly, I hope it has the same effect on you. I still have nostalgic affection for Puccini's wonderful opera, but my adult sense of it has been informed by, of course, the research that a professional does. I teach college classes on this opera, but also, and this is significant, by a family experience. My older sister, Juliet Winters Carpenter, has lived in Japan most of her adult life. She has been, for decades, a faculty member at Doshisha Women's College in Kyoto. She and her American husband have raised 3 boys who grew up in Japan. And my sense of Madame Butterfly and my interpretation of it is informed by what she has imparted to me about Japanese people, their attitudes, their culture. And that will bring to bear, in a way, on today's discussion. So here we go. I think that the plot outline of Madama Butterfly is pretty familiar, even to people who might only recognize Un Bel Di, that iconic aria. A naive young Japanese girl marries a callous and cavalier naval lieutenant. She believes that it's a real marriage. We understand that he's not committed to it. And 3 years later, after she's been abandoned, she still stubbornly clings to the notion that he's going to return for her. And when he does, it's not in the way she hoped, and it leads to tragedy. Important to know that even though the libretto is derived from several works of fiction, even so, all of these works of fiction were based on historical reality, on facts, on actual incidents that occurred in Japan. The fact is that after Matthew C. Perry famously opened up Japan to the West for trade and for other activities, there was an influx of Western men, and lots of Japanese women dallied, got married to, interacted with Western men. Japan was transitioning from a feudal economy to a modern, technology-driven market economy. And women in Japan, during the time of the shogunate government, when it was a feudal society, they had nothing. There were no Japanese suffragettes, folks. And they had a hard-scrabble life. So when Western men came in with all their money and their wealth, Japanese women were happy to interact with them, to cook and clean and keep house for them, to bear them children and so forth. And guess what? Not one of them killed themselves. Not one. Now, these works of fiction, they include Pierre Loti's 1887 novel Madame Chrysantheme, a kind of semi autobiographical novel about a French naval lieutenant who has a short lived marriage to a Japanese woman. Elements of that story were incorporated into the novella Madame Butterfly by John Luther Long, who also, as a source, used the anecdotes and memories of his sister Jenny, who had been stationed in Japan for a number of years as a Christian missionary. And then, of course, David Belasco took that John Luther Long short novel and adapted it into a full-length stage play. That's what Puccini saw in a performance in London. And before you know it, Bob's Your Uncle, we have this opera. So it's important to realize that this happened, that none of the elements of Madame Butterfly were made up out of pure imagination, other than the climactic ritual suicide of Cho-Cho-san. And of course, Cho-Cho is the Japanese word for butterfly. It's where that comes from. So there are some things that we have to reason out. If this is a masterpiece, then the things that happen in it must be credible. You must be able to interpret them in a way that kind of jives with reality, with history, with fact. And yet some of the elements of the story are problematic. Why does Butterfly kill herself? Well, the short answer is John Luther Long thought that would be a sensational thing that would help sell more copies. You know, you already had the sex, now you add violence, and you got a bestseller, right? But that's not good enough. We have to see if there are if it can be explained in ways that are consistent with a Japanese attitude. And I think it can be. We also have to figure, why did Butterfly take this so seriously? Because, see, all those many, many thousands of Japanese women who were happy to enter into temporary marriages with Westerners, they understood what they were getting into. Let's quickly go through this before we even start hearing some music. There were three basic classes or ranks in society for Japanese women in the second half of the 1800s and into the turn of the century when the opera takes place. There were geishas. That's a term we all know. Geishas were professional entertainers. They were highly educated, highly trained. They had great esteem and value in society. It had been a professional status since the early 1700s. Geishas were very expert at traditional Japanese music, both instrumental and vocal and dance, and they were also trained in social graces and etiquette. You would employ a geisha to do a flawless hosting of a Japanese tea ceremony with incredibly correct etiquette and grace. They provided genteel companionship. And folks, sex was not a component of their job description. Then there were the rashamen. The rashamen were these wives for rent, women who would enter into a completely legal and legitimate arrangement with a Westerner for a temporary marriage. Both parties had their obligations. For the man, it was largely financial, to make sure that the woman was provided for even after he'd left for home, and of course to provide for any child that might result. These were supervised by government. They included contracts that were signed, and as I said earlier, nobody killed themselves when it was over. It would be like a handshake and say, well, keep in touch, bye now, have a safe trip home. No tragedies. And then, of course, the third class were just what were called the yuyos, the common prostitutes that have operated in the shadows of every society at every point in human history. So we have to try to figure out, well, let's approach it this way. Let's start looking at Act 1 of Butterfly. And this was David Belasco's invention. The John Luther Long novel begins where the opera's Act Two begins, after she's already been abandoned for 3 years. David Belasco says, let's get a backstory. Let's see what happened on their wedding day. And the first portion, the first scene of the opera belongs to Lieutenant Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton, who has chosen a Japanese bride that he's infatuated with, and he's talking about her with his friend, the American consul to Japan, Mr. Sharpless. And, they're waiting for the bridal party to arrive and the officials who will conduct the wedding ceremony and so forth. And Goro, his marriage broker, is there. And at one point, Sharpless says, so this girl that you're marrying, what is the deal here? Are you in love with her? And Pinkerton, he says, gee, love? I don't know if love, but she sure is good looking. And he sings a solo in which the only thing he has to say about Cho-Cho-san is how she looks. Her appearance, the graceful way she moves. He says nothing about her character, about any connection between them, about how she's so kind to children and dogs, about she's a wonderful girl. No, it's all about how she looks. Now, folks, in most operas that involve a love affair between a tenor and a soprano, you can tell how the tenor feels about the soprano by how she sings about her when she's not there to listen. Think of Aida, when Radames, before we meet Aida, sings Celeste Aida, pouring out his heart about his devotion to her. That's usually what you get. Now, Pinkerton is not like any other tenor hero. Here he sings Amore o Grillo, love or infatuation. I don't know. Now, let's rate that portion that you just heard from Lieutenant Pinkerton on the passion-o-meter from 1 to 10. How passionate did he sound? Not very. See, even if you don't know any Italian, you can get his attitude about this bride. He's awfully casual, awfully cavalier. Let me put it this way. Did you hear all those repeated notes, that monotone? Da 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 da, and so forth. As a general rule in opera music, monotones are not a great denoter of passion, of amorous passion. This is unusual. For instance, it's not like any other Puccini hero, any other Puccini tenor. Just compare it on the passion-o-meter with Cavaradossi and Tosca that we're staging for you next season. So Mario Cavaradossi is painting a blonde Madonna on commission, and he stops for a moment to consider the blonde woman's beauty compared with the far superior beauty of Tosca, who he adores, and you can hear now the passion in this vocal writing. Now we're talking. That's passion with a capital P. So there's no surprise here. In fact, Pinkerton's scene closes when he actually does sing with a big passionate outburst on a high note. And it's not about Cho-Cho-san. It's about the day when he will marry con vera nozze, with a real marriage, una sposa americana, a real American wife. So this is not a mystery. It's kind of like Columbo. We know who the bad guy is from the very beginning of the story. He's not going to take this marriage seriously. Now, before we get to Butterfly's entrance, I have a question for you. And it's a question that we could debate at some length if you and I were sitting at a Starbucks and just talking about this opera all afternoon. Have we been a little harsh in judging Pinkerton? Is he really the horrible villain that we have always characterized him as being? Because listen to me, he evidently feels that he's entering into one of those Rashomon arrangements. Folks, these marriages, exactly like Pinkerton's to Cho-Cho-san, happened thousands and thousands of times for decades. And nobody killed themselves. He's doing what many others on his ship, the Abraham Lincoln, are probably doing. He even mentions that his pearl of a marriage broker, Goro, has gotten him this great deal where the arrangement lasts for 999 years with an option to quit at the end of every month, and it only cost 100 yen. Perhaps Pinkerton doesn't feel that he's doing anything wrong. Now, is he a cad? Yes. Is he a craven coward? Yes. We will learn unflattering things about him. He's no saint. But I'm not sure that he understands. In fact, I think there's evidence to show that he's shocked and mortified when he discovers how seriously Cho-Cho-san has taken this whole thing. So, for doing it in the first place, well, it might not be in accord with our values, but it happened all the time, and he might have been within his rights to think that this story would have a happy ending. Well, it is time to meet Cho-Cho-san. Here she comes, trudging up this large hill on which they are going to live in this little rental house. Any of you who have been to Charlottesville, the topography of the general appearance of this part of Japan is very similar to the size of the hills and the geography of Charlottesville, Virginia. That struck me when I visited my sister in Japan in 2007. So everybody complains about the climb up to that house. And in Butterfly's first aria, we're going to hear a graphic depiction of that climb. However, first, many of you may know that Puccini, who always liked to incorporate authentic cultural elements into his scores, did a great deal of research on native Japanese music. He made a friend of the wife of the Japanese minister to Rome. She was quite knowledgeable in Japanese songs and tunes. She played them on the koto, that long, elongated string instrument. She sang. She had gramophone recordings. She had printed sheet music. And Puccini selected 10 native Japanese songs. They're all cataloged now. You can find websites that show you in which measures and which scenes of the music these songs appear. Sometimes it's a complete melody. Sometimes it's just a brief sliver, as we'll hear in Un Bel Dì. And it's always for a different reason. So thus far, through Pinkerton's scene, of course, it's been Western-style music, down to even a quote from the Star-Spangled Banner. As the Japanese cast, the Japanese characters are introduced, that would make sense, wouldn't it, for the first appearance of a Japanese native melody. And when Goro announces that here they come, they're almost here, we get a tune called Echigo Jishi, which is described as being originally kind of a Gilbert and Sullivan-esque humorous patter song about the domestic products from the Echigo district. Puccini liked this melody. It occurs several times through the opera, and here it follows immediately on the final reference to an American wife. Bang! Suddenly Goro comes in with a verbatim quote of this tune, and it's sort of like a head-on collision between the West and the East. Now, to give you an idea of what Puccini heard, here is Echigo Jishi played on the koto. And that is exactly what Puccini quotes, arranges in a Western style you don't lose the exotic flavor of it because the melody is reproduced verbatim, first with Goro breaking in, interrupting the two Americans, and then you'll hear in the distance coming up that hill the voices of the relatives and friends of Cho-Cho-san. And then it's time for us to hear, but not see, Madama Butterfly. This is a device Puccini used time and again. With Mimi, with Tosca, and with Cho-Cho-san, we hear the prima donna before we see her. I think just for the simple reason that it kind of builds up our anticipation for the entrance of the star of the show. In the case of Madama Butterfly, her entrance aria, Ancora un passo via, a couple of things I want you to listen for as we play a chunk of this. First of all, there is a device composers use called sequence. A sequence in music theory is when you take a musical idea and you repeat it higher and higher and higher, or lower and lower and lower. Now, the basic musical idea of this solo is the following. Da, 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 dum. And you'll hear that it, either in the orchestra or in the voices, higher and higher. Dee, da, da, dum, da, 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 dum, dee, da, da, dum, and so forth. And why are we doing that? Well, think about it. What is she physically doing? She is climbing a steep hill. So the climbing, the ascent of the music is graphically depicting her climb up the mountain. But what else is rising? What else is ascending? Her hopes, her dreams, her excitement at marrying this godlike American. And then finally, Puccini wants us to fall in love with Cho-Cho-san the way he did himself. It's well known that Puccini fell in love with his characters as a way of kind of escaping into a fantasy from his dysfunctional, unhappy marriage in real life. So he's under the spell of Cho-Cho-san. Pinkerton is infatuated with her, and he wants us to fall in love with her immediately. And as you listen to her voice, surrounded by a cloud of angelic female chorus members, this is the epitome, it's the apotheosis of femininity, delicacy, and exotic appeal. This is as feminine as music can get. Oh, yeah. At that point, I myself am a grease spot in my seat where my body used to be. I melt. All right, so we have some chit chat, some small talk. We observe her family, her drunken uncle who's having a little bit too much sake. And the wedding takes place. The actual Japanese national anthem is played as the registrar enters. And before you know it, they're man and wife. Now, during the small talk, Butterfly describes her life before meeting Pinkerton and says that she is a geisha. Keep that in mind. Again, we'll talk about this geisha status that she gives to herself when we hear her great aria "Que tua madre" from Act 2 in a few moments. Um, that's significant. Is she a geisha? Well, we'll talk about that. But now the big plot twist happens, so I hope you're sitting down. This is going to come as a big shock. Everything goes wrong. Um, and this it will be something we'll need to talk about for a minute. Her uncle, the Bonza, arrives and spoils everything. We hear him screaming as he climbs up the hill. And when he arrives, he curses her because she has done something that none of these other Japanese women do. None of those thousands of women, not the Japanese woman in Madame Chrysantheme, the Pierre Loti novel. See, in Japan, it was fine if a native woman wanted to consort with a Westerner in a temporary marriage. Fine, do what you need to do, make a little money, good for you. But Cho-Cho-san has crossed the red line. Her uncle has observed her visiting the Christian mission, and he's done a little digging and like a private eye and found out that she is abandoning her Buddhist heritage and intends to become a Christian like her American husband. That's a deal breaker, and everybody reproaches her. You'll hear her, all of her community, all her friends and relatives screaming at her, climaxed with the Bonza and everybody else saying, Ti rineghiamo, you renounced us, so we renounce you, interspersed with some angry outbursts from the highly insulted Pinkerton. Okay, now this is obviously a significant moment in the opera, but in a larger context than perhaps you ever realized. Because we have to talk about an element of Japanese society. You know, the reason that it was a big deal when Commodore Perry opened Japan up to the West is that for centuries Japan had been a closed society. No foreigners, no outsiders. In many ways, folks, it remains somewhat of a closed society. When I spent 2 weeks in Japan, I went to Hiroshima, Kyoto, Osaka, Tokyo, several of the big urban centers. And my big thing that I realized is that I guess this will sound ironic, but you know, Japan is just chock full of Japanese people. It's amazing. And not many others. I didn't see people with black skin in Japan. I didn't see a lot of Westerners. And the idea of a closed society extends to this. You know, it's the opposite. It's a closed society in that it's the opposite of the American ideal. Um, our tradition has been that when you come here, you become one of us. So there are Italian Americans, Irish Americans, German Americans, Mexican Americans, African Americans. You come here, and while you may honor your heritage, nevertheless, we are a melting pot. You become one of us. And the thing that you have to understand about Japan is it's the opposite. You're never one of them. Never. Now, they're wonderful people. They will treat you like royalty. And here I draw upon my sister Juliet's experiences. She's been teaching at this college for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. Her students love her. Her neighbors treat her like a princess. But the Japanese have a term, gaijin. 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 It means outsider, foreigner. And despite the fact that my sister has resided there all of her adult life, raised her family there, she is still Gaijin. Her sons are Gaijin. They're born there. You know, you're born in America and you're automatically a citizen. Not there. And the thing about the Bonza, who is a Buddhist monk, coming to disrupt Butterfly's wedding and renounce her, and everybody else renounces her, is that by this decision to become a Christian, Cho-Cho-san has made herself a gaijin. She is a native-born Japanese who is now considered a foreigner. Fine, you want to worship a Christian God? You want to be American? Then you're no longer Japanese. We renounce you. You are dead to us. She is gaijin, forever an outsider. See, this explains a lot. This explains a lot of the decisions that she makes, a lot of her attitudes about her marriage, and really, in the end, why she has to commit ritual suicide. Because when Pinkerton comes back at the end of the opera, and he has an American wife and he doesn't want her, you see what that means? It means that now she's also gaijin to America. She belongs nowhere. She is part of nothing. She has no citizenship anywhere. So she feels that she has no options. This really has to be taken into account. And in that way, John Luther Long's decision to have her commit suicide is not merely the sensationalism of lurid fiction. It does have roots in Japanese society. Well, you know, she's curled into the fetal position. She's sobbing. The poor kid's only 15 years old. And Pinkerton comforts her. Now, let me tell you something. I have a theory about Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton, and I could be dead wrong. If Puccini was listening to this broadcast, he might say, "Oh, Glenn, no, son. You're thinking too hard. Just listen to the pretty music." But I think I'm right. And here's my theory. In Pinkerton's first scene, he was the ugly American. He was crass, he was callous, he was mocking of the Japanese people, making fun of Suzuki, the maid who's going to be servicing them. Very cynical, not very nice. But when he's on stage with Butterfly for the rest of Act One, he is a different person. He is empathetic. Now, of course, he wants to sleep with, have sex with Cho-Cho-san. So he's going to be sort of nice as he can be, but I'm not sure how nice Pinkerton is capable of being because he's displayed no empathy whatsoever. Listen to him as he comforts her as they're first alone together. And he says, "Bimba, non piangere. Baby, don't cry. It'll be okay. Listen, just don't even listen to those people. You've got me now." And he says, "Just a few tears on your dear, sweet face are worth more than all the Buddhist monks in all of Japan." And she looks up and says, "Really?" Listen to the caring and empathy. He's perfect. And then I'll tell you what my theory is. He's perfect. He's exactly what a tender, caring, empathetic husband would be. And that, in my opinion, is not Pinkerton. Here's what I think is going on. I think that opera music is capable of literary values. I believe opera music can depict point of view like you get in fiction. I think that opera music can suggest third-person point of view or first-person point of view. And here's what I think is going on. In the first scene, when we see the callous, cynical rude Pinkerton, the guy who doesn't care about anything. I think that's the third person objective, but I think once Butterfly is on stage, we see him through her point of view. We see him through the prism of her expectations that he's this godlike, perfect American, wonderful person. And so it is skewed. We see him through the filter of how she sees him. It's kind of like when you're on a first date with somebody you're attracted to and they haven't really been courting or anything. They're spending their first time alone together. You know, when you're on a first date with somebody, they seem perfect. You don't know anything bad about them. Their breath smells like toothpaste. They laugh at all your jokes. They listen raptly to your story about the hamster you had in sixth grade. You know, it's much later you find out they're not really perfect. I think that's the point of view we're getting here. I think the real Pinkerton might have thought, oh man, great. Here she goes. Here come the waterworks. All right, listen, Cho-Cho-san, stop crying, okay? Listen, I got to be on duty at 0600 tomorrow morning, so let's get this show on the road, okay? Stop your crying. Everything's fine. That's the Pinkerton I expect, not the Bimba non piangere. So we have this famous love duet, the one that Glenn Close seduced Michael Douglas to in Fatal Attraction back in the 80s. It is the most seductive, sumptuous, erotic, passionate, throbbing love music that you can ever have. And yet there's an irony to it, as there is in most love duets from the Verismo period of opera history. You know, in old-fashioned operas that were more like fairy tales, when the soprano and the tenor had a love duet, they meant it. And if something went wrong, it was because the evil baritone abducted her or poisoned her, or, did something terrible. In the Verismo period, more true-to-life, grittier dramas, very often there's something rotten about the love duet. Either it's adulterous, as in Pagliacci, or in this case, we know that the tenor doesn't really mean what he's singing, except when he says, "Be mine." And it's beautiful. You'll love it, but we don't have time to play it. Let's just hear the very end, because Puccini, mindful of architecture and symmetry, ends the duet the same way that Butterfly made her entrance, with that climbing sequence of that same dee-da-da-da motive. And of course, this time, what's rising is she's not climbing a hill like she was before. What's rising is, for both of them, their sexual desire on their way to a passionate wedding night. So the curtain comes down, and Act One ends with bliss, ecstasy, flowers, happiness. Curtain comes up on Act Two, and what a difference 3 years has made. Now, things are pretty bleak. Things are pretty hopeless. Pinkerton's money has run out. Poor Suzuki, the maid, is stuck in what she knows is... Suzuki isn't stupid, okay? She knows what's happening. He's not coming back. They've got about $1.13 left in their checking account and a quarter cup of rice, and things are looking bad. But not for Butterfly. Butterfly must cling to the notion that Pinkerton is coming back. Why? Because she is gaijin. Because she has no opportunities to rejoin her community, her family, and her relations. In terms of Japan, her only hope now is to have a life as an American wife. So she tries to imagine what it will be like when Pinkerton returns to kind of boost poor Suzuki's morale a little bit in this iconic aria, Un bel dì. Un bel dì was a kind of a modern version of an aria, more like a soliloquy or a monologue than something with verse, refrain, like old-fashioned opera arias. And old-fashioned opera arias also tended to have one affect from start to finish. Either you're calling for blood throughout, like Di Quella Pira, or you're happy throughout or flirtatious throughout, like Carabino. Uh, in the Verismo period, we get these roller coasters of emotional affects. So Butterfly starts off with this time a descending sequence, a musical idea that goes lower and lower. I still haven't figured out if that means anything. But the affect here is one of serene, unruffled confidence in her faith in Pinkerton. Don't know. Perhaps the descending motion and contour of that line means that despite her brave words, perhaps her hopes are kind of sinking in spite of themselves. I'm not so sure that's it. Puccini's dead. We can't ask him. But now I want to talk to you about 6 notes in the middle of this aria that blow my mind. There is a quotation from an authentic Japanese song, but only a sliver. 6 notes out of a song called Jizuki Uta, a workman's song about growing rice. Now, later, when she sings her second act aria, Que tua madre, she will quote the entire song. But right now, just 6 notes. It's like taking a cutting from a plant and repotting it. And the 6 notes are this. Da, 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 da. I want you to listen for them, and then I'll tell you why they blow my mind. You heard them, right? Those are 6 notes taken from a lengthy song called Jizuki Uta. Why? Well, right at that moment, she was fantasizing watching Pinkerton approach their house. And in those 6 notes, she was imagining him climbing that hill. And of course, those 6 notes did have a rising contour, didn't they? So once again, it's describing the climb. But why the? Well, all I'm going to tell you is at the end of this broadcast, the last thing you will hear are those 6 notes. And the tremendous tragic irony will be devastating. But that'll be in a few minutes. Now, what happens next is that there are some visitors. Prince Yamadori comes. He's a very westernized Japanese aristocrat who really would like to hook up with Madame Butterfly, but she keeps putting him off because, after all, she's a happily married American wife. I don't have time to play it, but I'll just tell you that when Prince Yamadori enters, the orchestra plays a very flamboyant, swashbuckling version of the Japanese song My Prince. So kind of an obvious reason for choosing that one. But we also have the American consul, Pinkerton's friend Sharpless, who has dropped by, and he's dropped by with a mission because obviously he's been in touch with Pinkerton saying, this girl, you're she's taking it seriously. You've got a disaster in the making here. You've got to fix this. So Pinkerton has written a letter that he wants Sharpless to read to her. That's gonna, let her down gently, kind of help her see what the reality is. And it's a duet that I think gives support, gives evidence to my theory about Pinkerton's dual nature in the opera, being crass and ugly and cynical in his scene, but then being the empathetic, perfect husband when he's on stage with Butterfly. Because everything that Sharpless rather reads from this letter, Butterfly misinterprets in a way that flatters Pinkerton. When Sharpless reads, "It's been 3 years since we were together," the Butterfly interrupts and says, "Oh, he's been counting the years just like me. He loves me," and so forth. Here's a little bit of this pathetic, in the sense of being full of pathos, this scene between Sharpless and Cho-Cho-san reading the letter.
Amico, cercherete quel bel fior di fanciulla.
Dice proprio così?
Sì, così dice. Ma se ad ogni momento
Taccio, io nulla.
da quel tempo felice 3 anni son passati
Anche lui li ha contati.
e forse Butterfly non mi rammento più.
Non lo rammento, Suzuki, dillo tu.
So finally, Sharpless has to give up in frustration, put the letter away, and try to just talk turkey with her. But I think the way that Butterfly sees that letter in a way that we obviously don't means that she's got that point of view of idealizing Pinkerton. And I think that when she's on stage with him, as I said in Act One, we are forced to adopt her point of view and see a gallant, empathetic Pinkerton that doesn't really exist. That's my theory. I might be wrong. I'm allowed to be. But I'll tell you, even if I am wrong, this is a good way to think about opera characters. Don't take them at face value. Always ask yourself, what's going on? What is the music telling us? All righty, well, finally, Pinkerton says, look, got a hypothetical for you. What if he doesn't come back? What if he's not still really married to you? And she says, oh, he'll come back. And she goes off stage and returns bearing a child with, black hair and big round blue eyes. This is the child that she has born. And we know that Pinkerton is the father because, look, friends, do you hear those commercials that I hear on TV all the time for DNA tests? 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and you send a little tube of your saliva off and they analyze it, and it comes back in a few weeks and tells you that you're 2/16 Lithuanian or something. Puccini gives us musical DNA for this little boy whose name is Trouble. And the Japanese melody is another native tune called Kapore Onen. Here it is. Listen to the authentic version of this tune. Just that much. And I think what appealed to Puccini about that was that it can be converted into the typical arch-shaped contour of classic Italian opera melodies. Rising and falling. Verdi, all of his sopranos and tenors sing in these broad arch-shaped phrases, and Puccini employs it as well. Why? Because it makes trained voices sound really good. It's very flattering. So that turns into the appearance, a very triumphant and oversized version of Capore Onen when she returns bearing the child, but then also listen for the part that tells you that there's 50% American DNA, a very rapid fire version of the national anthem. So apparently nothing Lithuanian in this little boy. He's half Japanese, half American, and we heard it in the music. Very clever on Puccini's part. However, Sharpless is still trying to put the cards on the table and say, you have to prepare yourself. This might not turn out the way you want. And that's like a kick from a mule in its effect on Butterfly. This brings us to an aria that I myself prefer to Un Bel Dì, as much as I love Un Bel Dì. Que tua madre, I think, is one of the more powerful and devastating arias for Cho-Cho-san. And the interesting thing about it is that she has been singing mostly Western stuff, right? Her entrance aria, the love duet, there were no Japanese tunes in that material. Now, this aria is constructed of nothing but native Japanese materials. 3 Japanese songs, phrases from 3 of them kind of stitched together to form the fabric of this aria. And it starts with the Jizuki Uta, that melody from which he took 6 notes that we discussed earlier in Un Bel Dì. What she's saying in here, and why? Why now would she only sing Japanese materials? Because she's imagining the worst case scenario, that she's not going to be an American wife and she somehow has to live in Japan as a Japanese woman with no honor and being an outsider. And she says, I would have to go back to being a geisha. And this is important. She describes the life of a geisha that would await her. And it's problematic, and we have to figure out why she says it. Because she says, oh, yes, if I could not be Pinkerton's wife, then I would have to return to being a geisha. I would have to go out on street corners in the wind and the rain and sing and dance for strangers just to put food in the mouth of my child. Hold it. Hold it right there, Cho-Cho-san. That is not the life of a geisha. You are not talking about being a geisha. Geishas led privileged lives. They were highly ranked in society. A geisha would spend her time in elegant tea houses, hosting, immaculate tea ceremonies. What you're talking about is what musicians call busking. You know, when you see a saxophone player on a busy street corner blowing his horn with his instrument case open and hoping you'll throw a few quarters in the case. Busking in the wind and the rain, that has nothing to do with being a geisha. So why does she call herself a geisha? Well, this goes back to a bit of dialogue in Act 1 before the wedding. When Sharpless innocently asked about her father, Butterfly got all uptight and turned away and answered with a single word, morto, morte, he's dead, dead. And then Goro, the marriage broker, whispered, the family used to have a lot of money, but then the father fell into disgrace with the emperor. He was on the outs. The emperor ordered him to commit harakiri, and he obeyed. And then it all went away. Then the family was disgraced. They lost everything. They were into poverty and so forth. So my theory here is that Butterfly was probably raised and trained to be a geisha during that period when the family was in good standing in the community. But then afterwards, now she's clinging to that former status, clinging to that self-identity as being a geisha, even though it's not really available to her anymore. She's not going to be hosting tea ceremonies. She's going to use the training that she got in a disreputable way, busking on street corners in all kinds of weather. That's a little bit of pride that she can't let go of the status that she and her family used to have. That's the only sense I can make out of it. Well, of course, after Sharpless leaves, it turns out that Pinkerton, all during this scene, has been just moments away from pulling back into Nagasaki Harbor. Uh, the cannon goes off. Butterfly does what she's been doing 3 times a day for 3 years every day. She looks with her spyglass and she sees the ship pulling into harbor and she realizes it's Pinkerton's ship. Oh, the ecstasy. Oh, the joy. She and Suzuki decorate the house with flowers in a very Western, non-Japanese musical duet, the famous flower duet, and then begins the vigil. What you need to know about the vigil is that this is reproducing one of the great moments of David Belasco's play. David Belasco was a theatrical genius who lived during the dawn of the age of electric stage lights. And in the scene in which Butterfly waits all night for Pinkerton to appear, David Belasco contrived lighting effects that showed the sun setting, the moon rising, stars coming out, the stars fading, and then dawn, and so forth. And people were stunned at this. It was a special effect the likes of which had never been seen. Puccini duplicated this with suggestive music as well, but by the time dawn comes, no Pinkerton. She puts her child to sleep, and when she is off stage for the first time in a couple of hours of stage time, a Pinkerton appears, and of course he's got a plump, rosy-cheeked farm girl from Nebraska on his arm, Kate Pinkerton. And Sharpless explains that we're here for the child. Yes, we're not here for Butterfly. We're just thinking of the best interests of the child. And now, once again, Pinkerton is on stage without Cho-Cho-san, so the point of view shifts back to third person, and we see him for the jerk that he really is at heart. Now, I forgive him for not having understood that she would take this marriage so seriously, because once again, to harp on one of my big talking points, thousands of Japanese women entered into temporary marriages. None of them took it seriously. They all understood what they were signing up for, and nobody was heartbroken when it was over. So now when he sees the American decor, maybe there's a little American flag, he sees the cherry blossoms, he understands, oh my God, what have I done? He feels remorse. He sings a short solo that Puccini stuck in for one reason only, because otherwise Pinkerton only sings in Act 1 and Enrico Caruso would never want to do the role. So he throws a bone to the tenor in what is Puccini's by far worst tenor role, and Pinkerton sings Addio fiorito asil di letizia e d'amore, farewell, flowery asylum of happiness and love, and he's going to end it by screaming, Sonville, Sonville, I'm a coward, I can't face her, you guys take care of it, I just can't be here. And he runs off like the coward he is. But his solo has a bittersweet beauty of self-awareness. He finally realizes what he's done. when Pinkerton has run off in his cowardly manner and Butterfly emerges and instantly understands the situation when she sees Kate. Her answer is, yes, I'll give you the child, but not to you. Nope, if you want the child, I will only give him to Pinkerton. You tell him to come back, and he may take possession of the child. They leave, and she makes preparations to die with honor, since she cannot live with honor, taking out the ceremonial sword with which her father disemboweled himself years ago. And her final solo comes when Suzuki pushes that 3-year-old boy into the room, perhaps hoping to get her to change her mind. Butterfly scoops him up and sings a solo, a song of farewell to him, which is like the eruption of a volcano of torrential grief. And as you listen to this, keep in mind, Cho-Cho-San is a gigantic role. It is very challenging. It is emotionally draining and vocally difficult. And by the time you get to this final solo, the poor soprano, she's at the end of her rope. She's drained emotionally. She's exhausted vocally. It's a difficult role. And yet, just understand, you'll hear that the orchestra is thundering. She has to project her voice over a massive tsunami of orchestral roaring. And this is not easy. As a matter of fact, I'll share with you that the soprano in this recording, Mirella Freni, never performed the role of Cho-Cho-San on stage. She only recorded it because it's in the recording studio that you can twist the dials and make sure that her voice sails out over a thunderous orchestra when it might have been covered in real life. This takes courage to sing. She is gaijin, rejected by Japan, rejected by America, and so the blade is plunged into the abdomen, and she bleeds out. And as you'll hear, the final music that we get is Japanese, because in death, having died with honor, in her mind, she's dying, once again, a Japanese woman. But remember those 6 notes? Remember when I played you from the middle section of Un Bel Di, 6 notes, a sliver of the song Jizuki Uta. Di da 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 da. And remember what she was talking about on those 6 notes, about seeing Pinkerton climbing the hill on his way to a happy, amorous reunion. He is climbing the hill. Well, the last thing we hear as she bleeds out and dies in front of us is Pinkerton's voice off stage, screaming her name, Butterfly, hoping to come and save her life. Of course, too late. And what do we hear in between his cries? we hear those same 6 notes. What she predicted is true. He's climbing that hill just like she said he would be, but it's not joyous, it's not amorous, and so those 6 notes are incredibly ironic in the most tragic way possible. Now we understood what they meant. And that final motive that the orchestra was playing in thunderous unison was called the Song of Foreboding, another Japanese tune, Suryobushi, as the curtain comes down. Those 6 notes, man, I don't know 6 more potent notes in all of opera history. Now, I'll close by making this observation. The last time I spoke with you, it was about Donizetti's comedy, L'Elixir d'Amore, The Elixir of Love. These 2 operas, Elixir and Butterfly, have 2 important things in common. You wouldn't think so. You wouldn't think they had anything in common, but they do. One is that they're about characters who mature, who go from naive, childlike innocence to a state of adult maturity from beginning to end. But the other thing is they're about the same thing. They're about the power of belief. And importantly, they're both about believing in something false. Nemorino believed that cheap wine was a love potion, but it was a comedy, so it worked out the way he wanted. Butterfly believes that a craven, cynical American really loves her. She has absolute belief, but this is a tragedy, and so the ending is tragic. Don't miss this production, and I hope to see you there. Thanks for listening.